Good morning. I'm Dr. James Benoit, and I'd like to welcome everyone to today's WICRI learning session entitled How to Write a Lay Abstract. Our presenter today is Meghan Riddell. Dr. Riddell is an assistant professor in the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology in the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry. Her work focuses on understanding complications during pregnancy at a cellular level. We are delighted to have her speaking with us today about effectively communicating the impact of our research to the public by writing effective lay abstracts. Before we begin, the University of Alberta acknowledges that we are located on Treaty 6 territory and respects the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. In addition, we would like to thank WICRI's funders, the Stollery Children's Hospital Foundation and the Alberta Women's Health Foundation, for making this session possible. This presentation is expected to last about an hour, with lots of time for questions at the end. And in addition, I'd like to remind everyone that this event is being recorded. And now I'd like to welcome Dr. Riddell and invite her to begin her presentation.
Thanks for the nice introduction, James. And here I will just start sharing my screen. So hopefully today I can help everybody to understand a little bit better about how to tackle the ever-hated lay abstract. I know that this is one of the most universally despised pieces of most applications because of how difficult it is. And so I hope today to just give you some tips and tricks about how to approach this in a way that makes it feel a little bit more achievable on an application by application basis. So first, we just want to acknowledge that this is supported by the CCHCSP. It meets the program requirements, and as well, it meets the requirements for the curriculum, for FDSR professional development credits. So today, oh goodness, sorry, I'm opening Chrome browsers that I shouldn't be through my slides. So today, as an agenda, what we will be doing is first going through, because ultimately a lay abstract is an abstract. So talking about what an abstract is, what an abstract is used for, then the components of an abstract, and thinking about how you compose one of these, and how all of the abstracts that you've ever written really have a fairly standard way of being composed. Getting into the meat of what a lay abstract is and why they're required. And then at the end of the session, we'd actually like to do some small group exercises working through examples. And before we do that, we'll actually use an example of my own work, both the technical abstract and the lay abstract, to help help with starting the conversations about what we're going to be looking at in these small group exercises. So starting it off, what is an abstract and what is an abstract for? Ultimately, an abstract, and I took this straight from Wikipedia, excuse me, an abstract is a brief summary of any complex scientific publication or research publication. And its purpose is to allow for a reader and for an audience to quickly understand what the purpose of the paper is, because as we all know, grant applications, publications, theses are very dense, very specific. And ultimately, we need something that will help everyone save time. And that's really what an abstract is for, is to help people move through huge volumes of information to quickly identify the things that they're interested in investing their time in investing their brain capacity in order to learn about it. So why we write abstracts ultimately, excuse me, is exactly for that. It's to allow people to quickly ascertain the purpose of a complex topic and have a brief overview of why we've done the work, and ultimately what the work will or has been done. And we also do it to attract attention to our work. So if everybody had to read through a 30-page paper or a 100-page thesis to understand everything, there wouldn't be very much attention. And this is a way to gather an audience and to have people decide to delve further into your work and to be excited about what you're doing and to learn the nuance and the details about it. So ultimately, the components of an abstract are similar, irrespective of whether it's a lay abstract or a technical abstract. Basically, we kind of start in a reverse pyramid, reverse triangle. So you start broad and you ultimately come to a very specific question, and then you go broad again to fill out the context. So starting with the relevant background information to identify the broad topic area of the work, to gather those readers that have the interest in the wider topic. And then you will bring in the focus background that'll allow for readers to be led to your specific research question. So you've most likely everyone here has either written or has definitely read abstracts. You know that you need to have the keywords and the key phrasing in there in order to lead people down your train of thought, so that they will all find it logical to arrive at your research question or your hypothesis. Then typically an abstract will contain some methodological information, depending on its length, about how you addressed your hypothesis in your research question. And then a summary of the most important results for work that has already been completed, or a summary of your anticipated results, the most important ones. And then placing all of the work and the findings of the work that will be done or has been done into context. So what we're here to talk about today is a lay abstract. And basically, a lay abstract is exactly the same as an abstract. It's just that it is directed towards a non-specialist audience. So it's not for people who are directly in your field. It's for members of the public. It's for grant administrators. And it is really a slightly different beast because of this, because you have to think about different types of communication and different ways of speaking in order to communicate to that audience. So how are lay abstracts used? This is something that's actually really important to think about, because it will help you to identify who you need to read or who you need to write these abstracts for. So they're really used to attract interest of researchers from outside of your specialty. Because a highly technical abstract will be like it's in a different language for someone who isn't in your direct field. And they're very importantly used to accurately inform funding bodies and regulatory bodies about your research. Anyone who's ever had to do an ethics application knows the importance of a lay abstract as well. It's in communicating what you're going to do to the public. And it's very importantly used to educate the public, to encourage engagement in research, and to show them the value of research and the overall breadth of research that's being done, so that they can understand the benefit of your research and of hopefully gain some interest in the field. So really going back to our Wikipedia summary, a lay abstract is just exactly same, a brief summary of a research article, thesis, review, conference proceeding, or any analysis or proposal on a subject that will help a non-specialist reader to quickly ascertain the work's purpose. So this all makes it feel like this is something that should be really easy, but you probably attending this session because you have tried to write a lay abstract and you understand that it is actually so hard. It is one of the most difficult things to write. I still find them very difficult to write. And there's multiple reasons about why they're so hard, but the main one is because you know too much. And when you are a specialist in a field and you're very invested in a project, whether it's something that you want to do or something that you've already done, it makes all of the details seem far too important. You want to show people your knowledge. You get caught up in the details. And the best analogy I have to it is my 4-year-old daughter, who predictably absolutely loves Frozen. And if you think about a lay abstract, it's an advertisement for a movie as well. They use a similar sort of communication. And where the trailer for Frozen 2, for example, is very interesting and compelling and gives you small details of the story and wants you to watch more. But my 4-year-old's version of a trailer for Frozen 2 is so detailed that you lose interest. And the audience is also not really on track with what she really likes, which is mostly the water horse. And it makes it really difficult for her to keep her audience interested and to advertise that movie. And it's exactly the same about research. And it's exactly the same problems that many children have in communicating their favorite topics. One of the important things to remember that's also intimidating about a lay abstract is that you look at it and you think that your audience is absolutely everyone, and that you want everyone to be able to understand what your research is based on this 500-word abstract. And that makes it a really overwhelming topic or a really, really overwhelming undertaking because that's actually impossible. So really, the first thing that you should be doing when you're writing a lay abstract or any abstract in general is identifying your desired audience. So really, successful communication is strategic communication, and taking the time to stop and to think about who it's most important for you to reach is what you need to do. So if my daughter wanted to reach her friends, who she knows also love Elsa, she could advertise Frozen 2 by talking about the details of Elsa's dress. And she may very well convince some of them to watch that movie. But if she is trying to get her mother to watch it, probably not as much. And you need to think about your research in the same way. Who is it most important for you to communicate to? What is the purpose of your lay abstract? Is this part of a grant? So is this really important that your lay abstract is accurately portraying your work at a level so that grant administrators can send it to the right grants panel so that it doesn't go to the wrong part of CIHR and then get to the specialist eyes that don't know what you're talking about? Do you want to be able to use your lay abstract to help recruit patients? So is this something where you want to really speak to patient groups or specialist groups of clinicians that would benefit from understanding your work, parents of children, young children, and educators, all of these things? So you really need to sit and think and write a list even about who your target audience is. And then you can think about how you can strategically communicate to them in order to tailor the words so that you will get allow them to understand it the most. And the most important thing that you can do, as with all writing, is show it to someone. And if you have access to somebody in your target group, then you should be showing your initial drafts of your lay abstract to them in order to have some very key feedback about whether what you've written is truly understandable. Because it's definitely true that the more that you're in a topic, the less you have perspective about what people can understand of what you're writing. And I also highly recommend that you change the person that you're sending your work to occasionally, because over time they'll become much better educated on the topic. For example, my husband can't read any of my lay abstracts anymore because over the last 2 decades, he's learned so much about the placenta that he can't properly identify whether the language is correct or not. So I now sometimes use my mother, or I'll use my friends that are GPs or other people that are truly outside my field, if it's a really critical lay abstract, to help me understand whether I've truly hit my audience or not. So it takes some courage to ask people that maybe you wouldn't normally ask a favor from, but you'd be surprised. It's something that people are interested in and they would like to know what you're doing. And so it's worth having a nice kind of rolling list in your head of people that you can access to get this sort of feedback from. So the next thing that I think is a really worthwhile thing to do when you're sitting down and thinking about what you need to write for an abstract is identifying keywords and messages. So you can literally sit down and come up with a list of keywords that are absolutely required to communicate what you need to communicate. And that will be the most effective at eliciting interest, as well as really hitting home with your target groups so that they'll understand. And don't be afraid to use essential technical terms as well. So you don't need to use language that is so far away from what you're doing that people won't be able to understand. So if you are writing something where an essential part of the work that needs to be communicated is something technical, you can use that term because it is essential, but just make sure that it's thoroughly explained and that it isn't just thrown in without some degree of education about what it is. And that the technical term has to be explained in the most basic terminology possible so that people can understand it. And another important thing to consider when you're engaging in a lay abstract, so with non-specialists, is that you should avoid acronyms. Or if you're going to use them, that you absolutely need to have them explained and be very, very logical. But in general, it's best to avoid the use of acronyms unless it's something that you would see on the news. And it's so well used in basically popular culture that people will immediately be able to identify it. And this is something that, especially in research, we tend towards all the time. And it's very tempting in an abstract to use acronyms in order to fit within the word or the character limit. But this is really a situation where you're trying to make it as understandable to a non-specialist that you're teaching them unnecessary language if you're using acronyms, essentially. Another important thing is to pay attention to the requirements of the language level. So this is often a suggestion, or it can even be a requirement. For example, for WCRI applications, it's typically has to be understandable at a grade 8 level. Personally, this is the part I struggle with the most. But you can write your drafts, and then there's many different tools available for estimating your level of writing. And one of the things to keep in mind, and this is my constant personal failing, is that your sentence structure also greatly contributes to readability. So if you're a fan of very long, complex, compound sentences like me, you're ultimately not going to be readable. It's better to use small, short, concise sentences in order to have that level of readability. And you can always go back and forth, changing around your sentence structure as well. And it's amazing how much you can bring understanding by decreasing the complexity of the sentence. So those are really my general tips and tricks for everything. And now what I would actually like to do is just to give you some examples, and then working through this example right now as a group. And I hope that we can actually get a little bit of engagement here, either through the chat box, or if you are feeling well dressed enough and up to it, turning on your camera and actually talking, because the next part of the session after this main presentation is we'll move into group work to do a similar exercise. So what I'd like to do now is actually use some of my own work as an example of, first of all, the difference between a technical abstract and a lay abstract, and using it as an example of how, when you're writing to a different audience, you can actually have slightly different messages. So the first example that we'll use for all of these exercises is actually a grant of mine from a couple of years ago that was a WCRI Innovation Operating Grant. So the technical title of it is the development of a physiologically oriented placental organoid culture model. So you can see that this is highly technical language. It's designed for a very specific targeted audience to understand. Whereas the lay title of the project is the development of a placenta in a dish experimental system. So something that is less technical, using interesting wording that will elicit a response from a lay audience and allow for a level of understanding. So the technical abstract, the target audience for this work was really the peer review scientists that would be looking at the grant. So for this specific grant application, because it was going to WICRI, and because there's not a great deal, there's not a huge community of pregnancy researchers at the U of A, I knew that the grant panel would contain people who are highly educated in related fields, but not necessarily specialists directly in my field. So I had to choose specific terminology and ways of educating these people about the nuance of my field, while also communicating the details and the importance of it to people who maybe wouldn't just inherently understand at the same level as I will. So I'm going to put the abstract up, and then I'll have a few moments of awkward Zoom silence so that people can read through it. And then what I'd like to do is, if people could start in the awkward Zoom silence, either turning their camera on, and then James will be able to perhaps call on you to identify some of the keywords and messages from the technical abstract. Now, I also appreciate, because it's a technical abstract, this may be a little bit more difficult, but we'll start here. Okay, so here's for our awkward Zoom silence for a couple of moments to read through. And then if you can start putting in the keywords and phrases either into the chat box or starting to talk about them yourselves. Okay, great.
Sorry, did you want me to read out the keywords as they're coming up here?
Yeah, sure, that's great.
Yeah, so we have a few of them. Organ of gestation, exchange of nutrients and oxygen, human placenta, and organoids so far.
Great. Any other thoughts? In vitro, yeah. Yeah, physiologic orientation, functional experiments. Progenitor, absolutely. Okay, I'll show you what I think from my perspective as the writer, as what the key phrases and words were that I wanted to be portraying in this abstract. So for me, the key things that I wanted to portray were placenta. So the overall topic was the placenta. You all in the chat box, yeah, preeclampsia I see in the chat box, that's good. You hit on the exchange, the interface between maternal and fetal. So I didn't apparently do a great job of talking about placental malformation and dysfunction. I wanted to talk about how there was a lack of good functional experimental models. And ultimately, we came to the keyword of organoids because that's what this work was about. It's about developing organoid systems. I'm not sure if I saw, yeah, physiologic orientation, exactly. I know that the key message from this work was that the goal was to develop these placental organoids, so these complex three-dimensional cell culture models that would form with the proper orientation, with physiologic orientation. So keeping in mind that list in your head of what these keywords were, and what the message of the technical abstract was. Now I'm going to move on. Okay, sorry, I forgot I had this. So from my perspective, this is what I thought the keywords and phrases were. So placenta exchange, problems in the placenta cause complications. We don't know much about the placenta. Organoid models are new, but they have a big problem. They're forming inside out. Our goal is to make better ones, and that this will ultimately facilitate research into the how pregnancy complications are actually forming, actually occurring. So then thinking about my lay audience, the target audience is going to be a bit different. So when I was writing this application, because it was for a grant, I knew that one of the important audiences was grant administrators, so that they would send it to the right people to be actually evaluated. That it would be important for the funders, particularly because this is funded through the donations from through the donors and the sponsors, that they would be able to understand my work, so they would be able to see the value in it and be excited about it, and be excited about contributing to the research because of it. One of the key people that I wanted to reach that aren't specialists is mostly about soliciting interest in my work would be medical doctors. So in this case, obstetricians or family doctors, pharmaceutical companies, because in vitro screening platforms are really important, and ultimately pregnant women. So that's quite a different list than the technical abstract. So here is the lay abstract, and I'd like you to do the same thing, identifying what the keywords and messages are in that abstract. And then we can talk a little bit about the difference between the two abstracts afterwards. And again, please put those key phrases and words into the chat box. Okay, we're seeing stuff starting to trickle in. Yep, growth of organs in a dish. Blood placental barrier, definition and function of the placenta. The surface of the placenta is important. Yeah. So these are just slightly different things than in the last abstract. Three-dimensional, drugs, yeah. Predicting whether drugs have unintended side effects. So that's not something that I really discussed in the technical abstract at all. Failure to grow. Okay, great. So from my perspective as the author, the difference in the messaging between the lay abstract and the technical abstract, a lot of it is wording, but the main messages are still there. So I needed to first introduce the placenta as the large, broader topic. and about the importance of the placenta, which isn't so different than the technical abstract. But this abstract has a little bit of a different bend on it, because I'd like to access, I'd like to solicit interest from a different audience. So knowing about drugs and drug barriers was introduced in this abstract, but not necessarily to the same degree in the technical abstract. And using different terminology to describe the same thing. So where the word organoid is introduced here, it's introduced much later in the entire abstract after an explanation of what an organoid may be. So a three-dimensional collection of cells, and ultimately breaking it down into something that people can understand and have a very vivid picture in their mind of as a little placenta growing in a dish. And so I hope that you can see that basically it's thinking about your audience and who you want to actually engage with, and who you want to engage and who you want to excite, and just about how you can put together the words in a different way in order to reach the different audiences, even about the same project. I mean, I have to admit that this is very unlikely to be a grade 8 level. I think that I failed, but they let me go through anyways. Just thinking about your audience, writing to your audience, and how sometimes it may actually be beneficial to write your lay abstract first. So for this application, I actually wrote the lay abstract first, because it allowed me to identify the overall themes and the really important messages, and then to tailor them to the more specific group. And sometimes it can be actually easier to start broader and to go to more detailed, so that you don't get caught up in all of the details. So, okay, so what I'd like to do now is to move into the group work. So what we're going to do is we're going to break off into groups of about 10 people. And you received in the invitation email a link to an online Google Doc. And there's 2 more lay abstracts in this Google Doc. And what we would like, yep, and there we go, Tanya has shared it as well in the chat. And what we'd like to do is give you about 15 minutes. And as a group, I hope that you can actually turn your cameras on and talk, read through the abstracts, work through identifying what the keywords are. And if you can put those keywords into the Google Doc, I'd like to come back after the 15 minutes so that we can have a bit of a discussion as a larger group about what the words that were identified, because it's always interesting from different perspectives. People will have different words that they will be able to come to. And then a couple of suggestions about how the abstracts could be improved. So I personally avoided that for mine, because it's I've had lots of feedback on it, but we'll come back as a larger group and be able to do a little bit of sharing about those keywords and phrases and some thoughts for improvements.